Chapter 9, Point of No Return. I felt trapped. My mother's attempt to rescue us from a disordered society caused us to jump out of one fire into a hotter one. This time we moved to an apartment located on 90th Street between Vermont and Budlong, an area alive with criminal potential. Society's underbelly was there to salute me the moment I set foot outside our home. The only school in the city willing to accept my registration was Bret Harte. Having to rise each weekday morning to prepare for school had become a forced formality I despised and resisted. School had failed me, and I had failed it. It would have broken my mother's heart to know the depth of anxiety I felt over an unpromising future. But no matter how I yearned for help or how intensely sentimental I felt toward her, my world was closed to my mother. At Bret Harte, I kept myself and observed others from a distance. Though two of my cousins, Leroy and Roland, both of whom I cared about, attended this school, we didn't hang out together. The fact was that we were as different as night and day. Our interests differed. My cousins were bookish and dressed like so-called squares. On the other hand, I dressed to match the thug persona I had sculpted to mirror the territory. I wore Levi's so starched I could have stood them in a corner. A high boy shirt or green army shirt, black leather coat, black suspenders, a black tam or gangster brim, and a black pair of biscuits, spit shine well enough to see a reflection in the toe. On occasion, I played football with my cousins and their friends, who were also the epitome of prey. Their mother Dolores was my mother's sister, and she wanted them to stay far away from me, the black sheep of the family. But I was the iconoclast of bullies, whom they'd run for protection from other bullies. I recall one day at school, Roland nervously told me about two characters with some others, ordering him and Leroy to bring their lunch money tomorrow before school or get beat down. If ever there was a portrait of being vulnerable prey, Roland and Leroy fit that picture. But they were my cousins, and I'd fight for them. The next day, we met on the corner of 90th and Budlong. I told them to walk ahead of me as though nothing was happening. While walking, I was distracted for just a minute by this girl, and when I turned around, two guys had my cousins trapped, their arms in the air and their pockets being rifled by the bullies. I ran toward them shouting, hold up, they're my cousins." Both of them stopped in their tracks, looking in my direction. With an exaggerated cockiness, I demanded to know what was happening. The would-be jackers were members of a street gang called the Manchester Park Boys. Both of them were non-imposing and about my height, weight, and size. I felt the odds were even. I could tell they were sizing me up to determine whether or not to try me. But just in case, I had concealed a switchblade for an equalizer. Maybe they recognized the fool in me or saw themselves in me, I don't know. But I was able to thwart their jacking scheme. As we walked side by side towards school, one of them initiated the who's name game to draw out who I was. This was a thug inquisition with potential to get me gang rushed if they discovered I was a loner with no backup. The guy running the list of names was Lester. He had the biggest afro I had ever seen, about 12 inches in circumference. When I heard Terry's name, I said, "Sure, I know Terry, we're tight." It was an exaggeration of the truth. They both eyed me with suspicion, probably hoping they could catch me in a lie. It was a favorable moment that Terry turned out to be the mediator in this conflict because he wanted a fair fight, not a mob beatdown. During lunch period, Terry waved me over to a crowd of hardcore gang members. One of them was Big Earl, a mammoth human being standing 6 foot 6 inches and more than 300 pounds. I hoped I didn't have to fight that monster. While standing facing a rowdy crowd who stared at me like vultures surveying a meal, Terry convinced Big Earl to let me fight Lester or Harold head up. He asked if I was willing to fight one of them. I boasted, "I'll fight them both at the same time." My cavalier response brought a roar of laughter from everybody except Harold and Lester. Neither of them wanted to fight, so we shook hands and the crowd roared again. Within a short period of time, I was accepted and respected by two formidable circles of homeboys from different geographical areas, but identical in behavior and survival mentality. It was an alliance unknown to either side. Both groups were willing, able, and ready to fight alongside me if necessary. At times, I traveled back and forth on foot to where my homeboy Donald lived, or he picked me up in a beige Plymouth borrowed from an elderly white lady whose lawn he cut. Together, we crashed local ditching parties and got so toasted on ganja, we had to kick back until our high came down. Shortly after that, drugs in general developed into a weakness I employed to soar briefly into forgetfulness before crashing to reality. Between getting high and ditching school, my grades slipped off the map. The principal warned, if you don't buckle down soon, you won't graduate. I attended classes, did a little schoolwork here and there, and graduated by the skin of my teeth. Because of low grades, I wasn't allowed to walk across the stage. Instead, I was handed my diploma out of the sight of the class, and good riddance. Graduation for me was just another insignificant formality that pushed me toward another phase of dice education. Pathetic but true, I was better educated about getting loaded than I was on scholastic topics. Long before high school, I was a user of street drugs. I graduated from sniffing glue to smoking marijuana to dropping Red Devils, a barbiturate that is a depressant. I became acquainted with downers by way of a 5'3" pimp named Little Tony, a mean little sucker who beat down his girls with a heated wire hanger, a baseball bat, or his fist. He lived with Billy, his number one prostitute, in an apartment on 94th Street. Sometimes I'd be there nodding off on Red Devils, only to be awakened by the sounds of Little Tony beating one of his girls, chasing her through the living room. While ditching school, I ran small errands for him or for one of his prostitutes and was compensated with drugs and money. Little Tony's apartment was heavily trafficked. His side job was as the local street pharmacist. Sometimes the apartment looked like the set of a motion picture, including a junkie shooting up gallery, a hardcore burlesque show, and a favorite spot for local criminals. The most horrific sights were of addicts overdosing and sometimes falling down, foaming at the mouth. Overdoses were commonplace, but most addicts knew how to revive a fellow addict who had passed out and was moribund. If an addict was beyond reviving, he or she was dropped off in a secluded area and an anonymous phone call was made to a hospital or morgue. Though it was impossible for any of us to forever block out reality with drugs, overdosing was always a possibility. I remember getting high with Mary, a beautiful black teenager whom I foolishly passed around like a marijuana joint to share. Somehow, I ended up stretched out on the steps of St. Andrew's Park Gymnasium with my head resting on Mary's lap as I slipped into an overdose. Mary contacted my mother, who showed up with Fred, and they drove me to Morningside Hospital where my stomach was pumped. Still sick, the next day I was at the 77th Street Police Station being interrogated about my drug use. That evening I was transferred to Central Juvenile Hall. The facility festered with unwashed youths. Chaos, hostile attitudes, random fighting, and the nastiest food I'd ever tasted. Each night I listened to the eerie sounds of other youth whimpering and screaming, "I want to go home, I want to go home." If screaming was a sure way to go home, I would have outscreamed everybody daily. It was my first time in juvenile hall, and for a while I felt sick, terrified, trapped, and as though the walls were closing in on me. I was claustrophobic. For 7 straight weeks I prayed and read the Bible on my knees, hoping I'd go home any minute. Like some of the urban schools I had attended, juvie was a warehouse for incorrigible youth where they would vegetate and sink into ignorance and confusion. It also served as conditioning and preparation for a youth's inevitable step toward prison, as though it was a boot camp, training recruits for the next level of armed services. At the facility, I learned absolutely zip, but it was very professional in teaching me to be more indifferent and embittered. Some of the dispassionate turnkeys were more diabolical than gang members. They appeared to suffer from mental disorders while taking out their frustrations on us. The institutional setting aped a primitive version of a reformatory school where no parent could rush to your aid. As a ward of the court outside the parental jurisdiction, a youth could be subjected to involuntary psychotropic drugging and testing, prolonged isolation, bodily harm, degradation, sodomy, and even death at the hands of a turnkey or another youthful offender. Imagine me or any youth trying to explain to a parent about the facility's atrocities. We'd be seen as liars, plain and simple. While in juvenile hall, I was often in lockup for fighting with juvenile J-Cats, distraught individuals with serious mental health issues, gang members, and some of the turnkeys. After each violent conflict, I welcomed the sight of a filthy bunk to rest and rejuvenate for the next encounter. It was during a brief stint outside of lockup that I ran into Bunchy, a homeboy I met at Horseman Junior High. At 16, about 240 pounds, Bunchy was barrel-chested with thick arms and looked wider than the door. Even though he was huge, Bunchy was a gentle giant and didn't fight unless roused. One day I was being bum-rushed in the gym by some Sportsman Park boys, and Bunchy emerged from his timid shell. He entered the fray, throwing bodies like human rag dolls all over the place. His size and strength were revered and feared, even by the ruthless turnkeys who sometimes had the difficult task of trying to restrain him. One day at breakfast, a Caucasian J-Cat spaced out on medication demanded that I pass him a pitcher of hot cocoa. When I told him to wait, he tackled me to the floor, but within seconds, Bunchy picked him up and slammed him hard to the ground. While it took the entire squad of turnkeys to control Bunchy, I was able to accommodate the J-Cat with the pitcher and the hot cocoa. They ended up pampering Bunchy, but I was thrown in lockup. After several weeks, the courts released me to my mother's custody. Though relieved to get out of juvie, I had a nagging suspicion I'd be back. Returning to the neighborhood, I fell back into the predictable rut of street activities. I was now going to George Washington High School, home of several gangs, in particular the Sportsman Park Boys, Denker Boys, a few Denver Lanes, and the Figueroa Boys. At school or in the hood, the Sportsman Park Boys were our number one menace, known for bailing out of cars to attack any one of us. My road dog was Erskine, a stocky, bow-legged, quick-tempered youth with a flair for dramatic violence. His attitude was, "I'll bring it to you." Both Erskine and I gained a reputation at Washington High for our willingness to fight the street gangs head up or catch them off guard in the school restroom or underneath the bleachers smoking ganja. In school, not too many places were off limits for us to initiate a blow against our so-called enemies, who suffered from the same misconception about who their true enemies were. The classroom was a kind of sacred territory devoid of fighting. It served as a sanctuary where we could momentarily unwind until the school bell rang. Then it was time to tense up again for possible conflicts. Gradually, as a result of all the fighting on and off the school grounds, most of the known gang members transferred to other schools, Locke, Fremont, or Crenshaw High, to sidestep our mounting efforts to destroy them. We proclaimed Washington High to be our school. This was our stomping ground. My homeboys and I ruled. Yet, we didn't financially own a centimeter of property. During school days, we'd meet and plan the day, foolishly sacrificing an education for the forbidden fruits of drugs, unprotected sex, fighting, strong-arming, and gambling. We could pretty much get away with anything except murder. The staff knew who we were and what we were doing at and around school, but they were too scared to stop us or didn't care. I believe the latter was the case.